Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to the Missing Dots. Modernity loves to judge the 7th century from a moral high chair, forgetting that today's world quietly runs on systems far more complex and often far more harmful than anything ancient societies ever imagined. We criticize old laws while our own era hides exploitation behind polished branding, global supply chains, and sanitized language. Chronological colonialism is the illusion that we are ethically superior simply because our tools are newer, when in reality many of our modern structures still echo the same human struggles, just wrapped in technology and paperwork. The Qur'an didn't imitate its environment. It entered a fractured world, set boundaries, elevated ethics, and built a framework that still challenges the assumptions of every age. The real question isn't whether the past was imperfect. It's whether the present is as enlightened as it claims to be.
Yeah. I mean, it is a really profound thought to start off with. And just sitting out here in the mosque courtyard with both of you, feeling the afternoon breeze after prayer, it just feels like the right setting to really sit with these ideas.
It really does.
Because the world out there is moving so fast, you know.
Yeah.
Everyone is rushing around. But right here, with the sound of the fountain and just the cool marble, we can take a breath and actually think about this stuff.
Exactly. I'm really glad you're here with us today, just sitting, listening. There is something grounding about this space. It makes you realize how much noise we are usually surrounded by on a daily basis.
Oh, absolutely.
So I was reading through some historical and sociological research recently, and it completely stopped me in my tracks. It really forces you to look at our current world, like secular modernity, and examine how it acts like this arrogant time traveler.
Arrogant in what way? Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, in the sense that we constantly judge ancient texts and ancient societies by our own post-industrial standards, while remaining entirely blind to our own modern brutality. There is this phrase I came across, originally coined by C.S. Lewis, called chronological snobbery.
Chronological snobbery.
Yeah. It is this automatic, unquestioned assumption we all sort of walk around with. We think that because we live in a time of smartphones and fiber optic internet and, advanced medicine, that our moral compass has somehow naturally evolved to a state of absolute perfection, too. We just assume newer automatically equals better.
Right. We completely confuse technological advancement with moral superiority.
Oh.
Like, we assume that because we have antibiotics, we must also have a cleaner conscience than someone who lived 1,000 years ago.
Exactly.
But to really figure out if that is true, we have to completely strip away our modern comforts. We have to look at the actual material reality of the 7th century. Like, look at the global baseline in late antiquity. What did the world actually look like before we had the luxury of judging it,
Let's actually think about that for a second. If you're sitting here with us, put yourself in that environment. There were no centralized banks. There was no fiat currency.
Not at all.
No paper money backed by a government that you could just transfer digitally. Wealth was entirely literal and physical. It was livestock. It was grain, commodities, physical gold, and silver.
And beyond the economy, I mean, think about the social infrastructure. There were no standing professional armies.
Right.
No international peacekeeping bodies, no Geneva Conventions. There was absolutely no welfare state. Today, if you lose your job or your farm fails because of a drought, there are safety nets.
You might get an unemployment check or go to a food bank or get government subsidy.
Exactly. But in late antiquity, if your crops failed, your family starved, period. And critically, and this is the big one, there were no penitentiary systems.
That is the one that really forced me to pause. No prisons.
Yeah.
We took the concept of a prison so much for granted today, but locking someone in a concrete building for 20 years as a punishment, that is a very modern invention. It really only became the standard from, the 19th century onwards.
Pretty much, yeah. Before that, a prison was just a temporary holding cell, like a dungeon, while you waited to pay a debt or be ransomed or face execution. It wasn't the punishment itself, it was just the waiting room for the punishment.
Right, because the infrastructure to house, feed, guard, and provide medical care for thousands of inmates just simply did not exist.
It couldn't exist. Society did not have the surplus calories or the administrative bureaucracy to support it. So imagine you are a leader in that 7th century world. A tribal war happens, and we have to remember, tribal and imperial warfare was just the default state of human existence back then.
It wasn't an anomaly, it was just the season.
Exactly. So the battle ends. Your side wins. But now you are standing in the desert with 500 surviving war captives from the opposing army. What do you actually do with them?
That's the thing. You can't put them in a prisoner of war camp. You don't have the supply chains to feed 500 angry men in a cage. You barely have enough grain to feed your own soldiers.
And you certainly cannot just let them go.
Huh.
I mean, if you release them, they will simply walk back to their tribe, pick up their swords, and attack your families again the very next month.
So if you are looking at it purely logically, the options in that specific environment are incredibly bleak. Option 1 is execution.
Right.
Option 2 is abandonment in the desert, which is really just a slower, more agonizing form of execution by starvation.
Or option 3, the globally accepted practice of the ancient world captive management, integrating them into households where they provide physical labor in exchange for food, shelter, and basic security. In classical Arabic terminology, this was referred to as milk al-yamin, which translates to what the right hand possesses.
Right.
It is so crucial to understand that taking captives in that era was not some cruel elective lifestyle choice. In a zero-sum geopolitical environment where resources were terrifyingly scarce, it was a harsh survival mechanism.
And we really have to compare this to other legal frameworks of the ancient world just to see the baseline. Like, if you look at Hammurabi's code, which governed Mesopotamia, penalties were entirely class-based.
Oh, absolutely.
If a noble harmed a commoner, he paid a small fine. If a commoner harmed a noble, he was executed. There were no universal mandates for the humane treatment of those at the bottom of the hierarchy.
And then you look at Roman law, which was the dominant legal and cultural force for centuries leading up to the 7th century. Under Roman law, a captive or a slave had absolutely no legal personality. They were classified as service, literally property.
Like a cart or a plow.
Exactly. No different from a farm tool. The head of the household, the paterfamilias, had absolute, unquestioned, legally protected power of life and death over them. He could sell them to the gladiatorial arenas, he could legally separate them from their children for profit, or he could kill them for breaking a vase without facing any legal consequence. That was the grim, brutal baseline of the world the Qur'an entered.
But wait, hold on. This is where I struggle, and I'm sure you, sitting here with us, might be wondering the exact same thing.
Sure.
If the 7th century was just this harsh, brutal survival of the fittest nightmare, wouldn't a truly divine, perfect law just wave a magic wand and ban all the harshness instantly? I mean, if God is sending a final message to humanity, why accommodate that brutal baseline at all? Why not just reveal a verse on day 1 that says all captivity is eternally forbidden and end it right there?
I get that. It is the most natural, human question to ask. We want immediate utopian solutions. But there is a concept in Islamic theology and legal history that answers this, often called divine pedagogy, a divine method of teaching and transitioning society.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Well, a universal law, if it is meant to actually work in the real world and not just exist in a philosophical vacuum, cannot demand an instant utopian reality that would immediately cause society to completely collapse.
Because if you ban all captive labor overnight in the year 610, what actually happens the next morning?
Total systemic failure. You have an entire global economy deeply dependent on that physical labor, and there is absolutely no wage labor market or fiat currency system to replace it. But even more importantly, look at it from the perspective of the captives themselves.
Right.
If you ban the management system instantly, without having state prisons to hold defeated combatants or international refugee programs to resettle them or state welfare to feed them, what happens to those defeated tribes?
They would either be slaughtered on the battlefield so they wouldn't be a future threat, or they would be left to starve.
Precisely. An instant ban, while sounding morally pure to our modern ears, would have actually resulted in exponentially more cruelty, mass executions, and starvation in its real-world application. The divine law didn't just passively mirror the 7th century environment. It actively entered it. It met human beings exactly where they were, in the mud and the blood of late antiquity, and it set radical, enforceable boundaries to safely transition society forward.
So it didn't demand a utopia that would break the people. It built a bridge to something better. Which naturally brings a mirror up to our own era, doesn't it? We look back across that bridge and judge them. But if the 7th century was brutal, yet deeply honest about its brutality, how does our 21st century compare? Are we actually morally superior today? Or are we just infinitely better at hiding our cruelty behind paperwork and marketing?
That is the most uncomfortable realization. When you start comparing the classical mandates of the 7th century with modern global capitalism, you see how modernity doesn't necessarily end exploitation. It simply sanitizes it.
It washes the blood off.
Yes, and puts a sleek corporate logo on it, creating a system where the consumer can pretend it isn't happening.
Let's actually look at the classical rules for captives under Islamic law. First, And most radically for the time, they retained legal personhood. They were not objects.
Right.
The Prophet Muhammad mandated, very clearly and repeatedly, that a master must feed a captive exactly what he himself eats and clothe them in exactly the same quality of fabric he himself wears. You could not burden them with physical work that would break them, and if the work was hard, you were commanded to physically help them do it.
SubhanAllah. Think about the psychological shift that requires. And what if physical abuse occurred? What if the master lost his temper?
The historical records are very clear on this. Physical abuse triggered mandatory, immediate emancipation.
Wow.
There is a well-documented incident in the Hadith where a man slapped his captive in the face. The Prophet was informed, and the legal ruling was instant met. The expiation for that slap was that the captive was now a free man. Furthermore, captives could not be sold to people who were known to be abusive, and it was strictly forbidden to separate mothers from their children.
Now, let's pause and compare those transparent, highly regulated, legally accountable rules to the modern equivalents we live with today. We think we don't have forced labor. But let's talk about private prisons in the supposedly enlightened West.
You're talking about the United States, the 13th Amendment.
Yes.
Oh.
Everyone is taught in school that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It is seen as the great moral triumph of the 19th century. But if you actually read the text of the amendment, there's a glaring, massive loophole written right into it.
Right, the exception clause.
Exactly. Slavery and involuntary servitude are abolished, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted.
Which means forced labor is entirely constitutionally legal as long as you label the person a prisoner first.
And it is a massive, multi-billion-dollar industry today. There is a government-owned corporation in the U.S. called Unicor. They make hundreds of millions of dollars annually in revenue. They manufacture office furniture, military uniforms, electronics. And how do they make such high profit?
Cheap labor.
Beyond cheap. By paying inmates wages that are literally pennies, often between 23 cents and $1.15 an hour.
23 cents an hour? You really just have to sit with that for a second. 23 cents. While they are locked in concrete cages, often for non-violent offenses, forced to manufacture goods for the open market, we look at a 7th century household where a captive eats the exact same warm stew as the homeowner, and we call it barbaric. But we are totally fine with a man making 23 cents an hour in a concrete box to build our office chairs.
And it goes far beyond prisons, too. Look at our global supply chains. The International Labor Organization, the ILO, released statistics recently estimating that right now, today, in the 21st century, between 28 and 50 million people are trapped in modern forced labor.
It's staggering. If you are sitting here listening to this and you are holding a smartphone or you drove here in an electric car, think about the battery. Think about where the materials come from.
Right, the DRC.
The Democratic Republic of Congo is ground zero for this. The cobalt mines there power the batteries for our phones, our laptops, our highly praised clean, green energy vehicles.
And the reality of those mines is horrifying. They employ child labor. People, including young children, are digging in toxic, unregulated pits with their bare hands. The environmental runoff is so toxic that it is resulting in severe birth defects for the surrounding communities.
But the thing is, when I buy a phone, I don't see the cobalt miner, I don't smell the toxic dust. I walk into a clean, bright, air-conditioned store with sleek glass tables, and a smiling employee hands me a beautiful white box.
Right.
But in the 7th century, the master lived in the exact same house as the captive. They ate from the same pot. They looked each other in the eye every single day. The accountability was immediate and physical.
That phenomenon, the hiding of the violence, is what sociologists call epistemic colonialism.
Yeah.
We haven't evolved past the violence. We've just altered how we perceive it. The 21st century replaced the leather whip with inescapable financial debt, and it replaced slave ships with multinational corporate supply chains.
So the violence hasn't vanished at all.
Not at all. It is just geographically displaced. We outsource the suffering to the global south, and we hide it behind 12 layers of corporate liability shields, shell companies, and subcontractors. So the Western consumer can purchase a product and feel completely morally clean.
It is the exact same dynamic when you look at how we conduct warfare today. We criticize ancient battles because they were brutal, but in the ancient world, warfare was face-to-face. You saw the humanity of the person you were fighting. You saw their fear. You knew the weight of taking a life.
Contrast that with today. Today, a drone operator can sit in an air-conditioned trailer in the Nevada desert, look at a grainy black and white screen, push a button on a joystick, and destroy a family home in Yemen or Somalia or Pakistan. It is treated almost like a video game. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism recorded over 900 civilian deaths from U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan alone over a specific period. And the most chilling part is the tactic of double-tap strikes.
Oh man, I remember reading about that. It is absolutely terrifying. For those sitting with us who might not know what a double tap strike is, it's when a drone fires a Hellfire missile at a target, say a house or a car. Then the drone loiters in the sky. It waits for medical rescuers, neighbors, and relatives to rush into the burning rubble to pull out the wounded and the screaming children.
Yeah.
And once a crowd of rescuers has gathered, the drone operator fires a second missile directly into the crowd of paramedics and neighbors.
Just let the reality of that sink in. Intentionally targeting the people trying to save the wounded.
Yep.
And yet, modern post-industrial societies consider themselves infinitely more civilized and morally enlightened than ancient societies that fought with swords on open battlefields.
Modernity isn't morally superior, it just delegates its cruelty to algorithms, remote controls, and distant sweatshops. We are completely insulated from the blood. We don't have to hear the screams, so we pretend we are peaceful.
Exactly. We judge the past for its lack of infrastructure, while ignoring how we use our incredible modern infrastructure to systematically exploit the vulnerable on a scale ancient kings couldn't even dream of.
But this brings up a crucial transition. If we acknowledge that 7th century structures like captive management were necessary, harsh survival tools that the Qur'an stepped in to heavily regulate and humanize, how exactly did classical Islamic law plan to move society beyond those structures? Because the goal wasn't just to stay in the 7th century forever, right? How does the law actually adapt to changing times without losing its divine anchor?
That is the genius of the legal architecture, and it is something secular critics almost always misunderstand. When critics look at Islamic law, they view it as a frozen solid block of ice from the year 632. They think it is just a list of rigid rules that can never breathe or move. But it is not a monolith. The legal theory is built on two distinct tiers.
Thawabit and Mutagarat.
Yes. Thawabit translates to the constants. These are the eternal metaphysical values. They are absolute, and they never ever change. Classical scholars, brilliant minds like Al-Ghazali and Al-Shatibi, identified these constants as the maqasid, the higher objectives of the law.
And those objectives are universally relatable, right? The preservation of life, the preservation of intellect, the preservation of lineage and family, the preservation of wealth, and the preservation of religion. Those are the anchors.
Right. No matter what century you live in, the law must protect human life. That is a constant. But then you have the second tier, the mutagayirat, the variables. These are the context-dependent applications. They are the specific physical mechanisms used by society to serve those constant objectives.
I was trying to think of a way to visualize this earlier. Imagine the objective, the constant, is to protect human life in a highly dangerous, fast-moving environment. Hundreds of years ago, if you were riding a horse into battle, the mechanism to achieve that protection was a heavy suit of iron armor. It made sense for that environment. Today, if you are driving on a highway at 70 miles per hour, the mechanism to protect your life is a woven nylon seatbelt and an exploding airbag.
That is an excellent analogy.
If you look at the past and judge them for not having seatbelts, you completely miss the point. They didn't have cars. The goal was always the exact same: preserve life. The tools simply changed because the environment and the technology changed.
And in Islamic jurisprudence, there is a technical term for why a specific mechanism exists. It is called the illah, the legal effective cause.
The underlying reason.
Yes, it is the why behind the what. The great 14th century scholar Ibn al-Qayyim stated very clearly that legal rulings, meaning the mechanisms, change with the change of time, place, custom, and circumstances. The Sharia does not cling obsessively to an old mechanism if the underlying reason for it, the illah, disappears.
Give me a historical example of that. How does an illah disappear?
Okay, think about the rules of commerce. There is a classical ruling called Talaqi al-Rukban. It strictly forbade city merchants from riding out into the desert to meet incoming trade caravans before those caravans actually reached the city market.
Why would they ban that? It just sounds like aggressive business networking.
Because of information asymmetry. Imagine you are a trader who has been traveling through the desert for 3 months. You have no idea what the current market price for grain or silk is in the city. If a savvy city merchant rides out to meet you in the dunes, he knows the prices. You don't.
Ah, I see.
He could lie to you, tell you the market has crashed, buy all your goods for incredibly cheap, and then go back to the city and sell them for a massive profit. He is exploiting your ignorance. So the mechanism was a physical ban on meeting caravans outside the city limits.
But what is the constant value there?
Market transparency. protecting the vulnerable from predatory financial exploitation.
Okay, so bring that to today. Today, a trader crossing a desert in a truck has a smartphone. They can check global commodity prices in real time on the internet before they ever reach a city.
Exactly. The ILA, the vulnerability to price ignorance due to physical distance, has vanished. Because the cause is gone, the mechanism changes. We no longer need a religious law banning people from eating trucks on the highway. It would be nonsensical. But the constant value, market transparency, remains eternal.
Right.
Today, that exact same constant is applied to ban things like insider trading on Wall Street or deceptive high-frequency trading algorithms. The armor became the seatbelt, but the protection of wealth remains.
That makes perfect sense. So if mechanisms can evolve when the societal context changes, how does this apply to the heaviest topic we touched on earlier, the classical regulations around captivity and slavery? Because critics will say, okay, if the law adapts, why didn't Islam just abolish slavery immediately?
Because you cannot mandate a mechanism before the society has the infrastructure to survive it. Instead, what the Qur'an did was create a liberation engine. It was a brilliantly designed sociological system meant to systematically dismantle captivity from the inside out, phasing it out naturally without crashing the economy or causing mass starvation.
I was reading how historians break this down into phases. It wasn't just a single rule, it was a psychological and economic restructuring of society.
Precisely. Let's look at the first phase. During the Meccan period, this was all about moral elevation and shifting the cultural psychology. The Qur'an, in chapter 90, describes the act of freeing a slave as the steep path to righteousness.
Wow.
Before this, owning people was just a sign of wealth and prestige. The Qur'an completely flipped the script. It made freeing people the ultimate sign of moral prestige. It seeded the desire for abolition into the spiritual heart of the believers.
And then the early Medinan period shifts from psychology to legal restriction.
Yes, the law stepped in and strictly limited the inflow of new captives to one single, narrow avenue: defensive warfare. All other historical forms of enslavement were categorically forever banned. You could no longer raid a neighboring tribe for profit. You could not kidnap free people. You could not enslave someone because they owed you a debt. The massive historical pipeline of human trafficking was choked off at the source.
But the third phase is what I found absolutely brilliant, the concept of kafara, or expiation.
This is where the law ties human psychology to social justice. If you committed certain sins, for example, if you broke a solemn oath, or if you accidentally caused the death of another person, or if you violated the fast of Ramadan, the legal and spiritual penalty was that you had to free a captive.
Just think about the psychology of that for a second. You get angry, you swear an oath you shouldn't have, and you break it. You feel an immense burden of religious guilt. You have sinned against your creator. How do you repair your soul? You have to walk up to a captive in your home, look them in the eye, and say, because I wronged God, I am giving you your freedom. It is staggering. It took the inevitability of human sin and turned it into an engine for human liberation. Every time society stumbled morally, a slave went free.
SubhanAllah, it is a perfect system. And the final phase was institutionalizing that freedom at the state level. The Qur'an mandated that a portion of the zakat, the mandatory state charity tax collected from the wealthy, had to be explicitly earmarked to purchase the freedom of captives. The government was actively buying people's liberty.
And there was also the mukataba contract, mentioned in Qur'an chapter 24, verse 33.
Yes, this was revolutionary. It gave captives an enforceable legal right to demand a self-purchase contract. If a captive wanted to work for their freedom and pay it off over time, the owner had to accept the contract. They could not refuse. And furthermore, the owner and the broader community were commanded by God to help finance that very contract out of their own pockets.
Okay, I hear all of this. It is an incredible engine for liberation. But I have to ask the hard question, the one critics always throw at us. If this liberation engine existed, and objective morality points toward freedom, why did it take 1,400 years for Muslim nations to officially, completely ban slavery? Why did human reason in the West seemingly outpace divine law? Why did the West abolish it first?
That is a very common narrative, but it is built on a highly sanitized, historically inaccurate myth. The idea that the West abolished slavery out of pure, spontaneous moral enlightenment is simply false.
Break that down for me. Why did the West actually abolish it?
First, we have to acknowledge that the West spent centuries running the Atlantic slave trade, the most brutal, race-based, industrialized system of chattel slavery in human history. And for centuries, that system was heavily, explicitly justified by Western theological and academic institutions. So moral enlightenment was entirely absent when there was money to be made. Abolition only gained real, unstoppable political traction when the Industrial Revolution occurred.
Ah, because of the shift in economics.
Yes, exactly. The invention of the steam engine, the mechanical loom, and the factory system changed the economic reality. Suddenly, wage labor became significantly more profitable than maintaining a captive workforce.
It's brutal math. A machine doesn't need to be fed when it's turned off. You just stop putting coal in it. A human being you own has to be fed, housed, and clothed 365 days a year, even in the winter when they aren't working the fields.
Right.
But with wage labor, you pay a man pennies for his 12-hour shift and then you send him home. If he starves on the weekend, it's not your financial problem. Wage labor is just a cheaper, more efficient way to extract value.
Precisely. And as we discussed earlier, even when the U.S. passed the 13th Amendment, it immediately birthed convict leasing. They arrested newly freed black men for minor infractions like vagrancy, leased them right back to the same plantations they were freed from, and worked them to death in coal mines. The structure of exploitation didn't end. It simply shape-shifted to fit the new legal environment.
But that still leaves the question about the Muslim empires. Why did they lag behind in official abolition?
Because Muslim empires did not exist in a vacuum. By the 18th and 19th centuries, they were deeply integrated into and subjugated by a global capitalist extraction system heavily dominated by European colonial pressure. The Islamic text provided the moral vector, the constant trajectory toward abolition from day one. But geopolitical realities, immense economic pressures, and the moral failings of human rulers prioritized imperial wealth over ethical ideals.
So the divine law wasn't waiting to evolve.
No, human societies were failing to implement the law's ultimate objective. The engine was there, but the rulers refused to turn the key.
That context changes everything. It shows how deeply our understanding of history is manipulated by the language we use to describe it. And this brings me to another huge area of misunderstanding. How did the early Muslims interact with non-Muslims? What were the borders? Because the terminology used by modern critics paints a very specific, very violent picture.
This is where we run into what sociologists call linguistic anachronism, or lexical colonialism.
Meaning, translating 7th century Arabic terms into highly emotional, politically charged modern English words that completely misrepresent what was actually happening on the ground.
Yes. Let's take one of the most controversial words, jizya. In modern polemics and media, this is almost always translated as a subjugation tax, or a penalty tax placed on non-Muslims simply for refusing to convert. It sounds like mafia extortion to a modern ear.
But if you actually look at the Arabic root of the word, JZY, it means compensation or reward.
Right. Historically, the jizya functioned as a bilateral citizenship contract. Non-Muslims living under Islamic rule paid this tax. But what did they get in return? They were entirely legally exempt from military service.
And we have to remember what military service meant in late antiquity. It wasn't sitting at a radar screen. It meant mandatory, bloody, face-to-face combat with swords and spears. It meant a high probability of death, amputation, and dying of infection. It was terrifying. Muslims were mandated by the state to fight and defend the borders. Non-Muslims were completely protected from the draft.
And if the Islamic State failed to protect those non-Muslim citizens from outside invaders, historical records show that the state was obligated to refund the jizya in full. Furthermore, non-Muslims were exempt from paying zakat, the mandatory wealth tax that every eligible Muslim had to pay.
So it was an exchange of services?
Yes. Compare that to a modern citizen today. You live in a modern nation-state. You pay federal income tax, state tax, property tax, and sales tax. And despite paying all of that, if a major war breaks out, the state still claims the absolute right to draft you into the military and send you to die on foreign soil. And you have far less explicit consent in that modern arrangement than a 7th century Jewish or Christian citizen had under the jizya contract. Yet we call the ancient system oppressive and the modern system free.
Another word that gets violently mistranslated is ganima.
Yes, often translated in English texts as plunder, loot, or booty. It paints a picture of chaotic, bloodthirsty barbarians stealing everything they can find. But legally, ganima was highly regulated, state-managed resource redistribution. All captured assets were collected by the central authority. And the Prophet Muhammad distributed specific shares to orphans, widows, and the destitute first, before the military commanders or even his own household received anything. It was an early form of welfare funding drawn from the spoils of defensive war.
And then there is the big geopolitical concept that critics love to bring up. The division of the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, the abode of Islam versus the abode of war. Critics argue this proves that Islam demands a perpetual, unending state of holy war against the rest of the non-Muslim world until everyone is conquered.
The research on this is very clear, and it dismantles that critique entirely. That binary division, Darul Islam and Darul Harb, is not a Quranic mandate. You will not find those terms in the Quran. They were not commanded by the Prophet.
Then where do they come from?
They were descriptive juristic tools developed centuries later by legal scholars to classify territories. Why? Because in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, the default state of international relations was total, perpetual war. There was no United Nations. There were no international embassies or passports. You either had a specific negotiated treaty with a neighboring empire, or you were legally at war with them. The scholars needed a practical way to describe this harsh reality for legal purposes, like trade regulations and travel safety.
So it was just a map of political reality, not a theological command for eternal violence.
Exactly. It is no different than how, during the Cold War, Western politicians divided the entire globe into the free world versus the communist bloc. Or how modern politicians talk about an axis of evil. It is geopolitical shorthand. To claim it is a religious mandate for endless war is historically illiterate.
Okay, but what about the actual verses in the Qur'an about fighting? The sword verses, chapter 9, verses 5 and 29. Critics bring these up constantly. They isolate them and say, look, it says right here to fight the disbelievers wherever you find them. The religion is inherently violent.
This is where context is absolutely everything, and ignoring it is intellectual dishonesty. Those specific verses in chapter 9 were revealed during a very specific historical crisis. They were addressing treaty-breaking superpowers, specifically the Byzantine and Sasanian empires and their allied tribes, who had repeatedly committed treason and were actively mobilizing massive imperial armies to annihilate the early Muslim community in Medina.
So it wasn't a general command to walk down the street and fight anyone who wasn't Muslim.
Not at all. It was a specific military directive for a specific existential war. The foundational rule of engagement is in Quran chapter 2, verse 190, which explicitly restricts war to defense and proportionality. Fight in the way of God, those who fight you but do not transgress. Indeed, God is not like transgressors. And history proves this. Early Islamic expansions often involved negotiated surrenders, called sulh. When Muslims entered Jerusalem or Damascus, they didn't burn the cities to the ground. They signed treaties that explicitly preserved local churches, synagogues, and the lives of the inhabitants. This was a stark contrast to Roman Crusader or Mongol conquests, which routinely involved the total annihilation of the population and the burning of libraries and places of worship.
I hear that, but I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of a critic. Let's talk about the peaceful conquest of Mecca. It was bloodless, yes, but the Prophet immediately ordered the destruction of the 360 idols around the Kaaba. Secular critics look at that and say, aha, religious intolerance, iconoclasm. You are destroying someone else's religious symbols. Even if nobody died, that is fundamentalist oppression. How do we address the religious tolerance aspect of that specific event?
That is a fair question to ask from a modern perspective, but we have to look at what those idols actually represented in that specific society. The idols in the Kaaba were not just personal spiritual totems, they were the political and economic anchors of a violently oppressive, wealth-hoarding oligarchy, the Quraysh. That leadership had used the pilgrimage to those idols to consolidate wealth, exploit the poor, and justify the torture, starvation, and exile of the early Muslims for decades. The idols were the physical manifestation of a tyrannical regime.
So destroying them wasn't just about theology, it was about breaking the political power of an oppressive system.
Yes, and the hypocrisy of the modern critique is stunning. Modern, secular states engage in massive ideological warfare and force regime change constantly. Look at the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or the intervention in Libya in 2011. These wars were justified by the rhetoric of spreading democratization, removing dictators, or searching for weapons of mass destruction.
And what was the actual cost of that modern regime change?
Hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, entire societies destabilized. In Libya, the power vacuum literally resulted in the creation of open-air slave markets being filmed on smartphones. So modern states will destroy entire nations, cause mass death, displace millions, and call it liberation and spreading freedom. But they sit back and critique the bloodless breaking of stone statues that represented decades of actual oppression in the 7th century, calling that intolerant.
It is the absolute definition of chronological snobbery. We excuse our own oceans of blood because our intentions were supposedly democratic, but we condemn their bloodless actions because we don't understand their context. This lens of cultural anachronism, projecting our modern assumptions backward, applies so heavily to another massive area of secular critique: gender dynamic.
Yes. This is perhaps where chronological colonialism is most obvious. The modern critique looks at classical Islamic law regarding women and declares it inherently patriarchal, completely ignoring the baseline of the world before the Qur'an and completely ignoring the failures of modern egalitarianism.
Let's establish that baseline for a second. In the pre-Islamic world, not just in Arabia but across many ancient empires, women were literally treated as inheritable property. If a husband died, his male relatives could literally inherit his widow against her will as part of the estate.
The Qur'an shattered that reality. It established absolute female legal independence. A woman retained her own name after marriage. But modern critics point to specific classical rules and claim they are unfair. Let's take the most famous one, inheritance. The rule where, in certain cases, a male relative inherits twice the share of a female relative. The 2-to-1 ratio.
Right. To a modern ear, that sounds like the law is saying a woman is only worth half of a man.
But that is a fundamental misunderstanding of Islamic economic law. The inheritance distribution is strictly tied to the concept of nafaka.
The financial obligation of maintenance.
Exactly. In that social structure, the male had the sole, absolute legal obligation to spend his wealth to maintain the family. He had to provide housing, food, and clothing for his wife, his children, his elderly parents, and any unmarried sisters. His money was not his own, it belonged to the family unit. A woman's wealth, however, whether from inheritance, business, or her bridal gift, was entirely 100% her own. She had absolutely no legal obligation to spend a single coin on household expenses.
So the inheritance share wasn't a statement on human worth. It was tied to the financial burden placed upon the individual by the law.
Precisely. The man gets twice as much because he is legally forced to spend it on others. The woman gets half, but she keeps all of it for herself. It is a balanced economic equation designed for a society without state welfare. And what critics ignore is that in scenarios where men do not hold that sole financial duty like certain maternal lines, women inherit equally, or sometimes even more than the male relatives.
But sitting here in the 21st century, the idea of one man having 4 wives feels fundamentally unequal. If the Quran was elevating women, why not mandate absolute monogamy immediately? How does one justify keeping the structure of polygyny?
Again, look at the baseline. Pre-Islamic Arabia and much of the ancient world practiced unlimited polygyny. Men had 10, 20 wives. There was no limit, and there were no rights guaranteed to those women. The Quran restricted it severely. It capped it at a maximum of 4 and conditioned it upon strict, almost impossible justice between them.
But why keep it at all? Why not just 0?
Because it functioned as a vital welfare mechanism in a post-war society. In a world constantly depleted of young men by warfare, you have a demographic crisis. You have thousands of widows and orphans with no breadwinner, and a society with no state welfare system, no life insurance policies, and very few avenues for female physical labor in the desert. How do you provide for them? How do you protect them from starvation or exploitation? Polygyny allowed those vulnerable women to be absorbed into legally protected, financially supported family units.
What about the rule on testimony? This is another major point of attack, Quran chapter 2, verse 282, which mentions bringing 2 women to substitute for 1 man in witnessing a contract. Critics say this is proof the Quran thinks women are intellectually deficient.
We have to look at the ilal, the context of that specific verse. That rule applies almost exclusively to long-term commercial debt contracts.
In a pre-literate society.
Exactly. We're talking about 7th century Arabia, a world where women were, by cultural practice, largely excluded from international commercial education and grueling desert trade routes. They simply did not have the background in complex financial instruments of that era. It was a practical, contextual safeguard for the validity of the contract, not an ontological statement on the female intellect.
I know that is true because in other areas of the law, their testimony is completely different.
Yes. In areas like personal matters, domestic disputes, or reporting certain crimes, a woman's testimony equals a man's. And in matters exclusive to women like childbirth or female medical issues, a single woman's testimony legally supersedes a man's entirely.
And the term qa'aman in chapter 4, verse 34, men being the protectors and maintainers of women.
It is often poorly translated to imply tyrannical authority or toxic masculinity. But the Arabic root of the word implies protective stewardship, carrying a heavy burden. And it is entirely contingent on the man actually taking up the financial responsibility. If he doesn't provide, he loses that degree of authority.
But a critic sitting here with us right now might say, okay, fine, I understand the history. That is all great for the 7th century. It protected widows, it balanced the economy back then. But today, we live in the modern world. We have absolute gender egalitarianism. Women work in offices, they have bank accounts, they can invest in the stock market. Why on earth should anyone hold on to those old structures today?
That is the ultimate question. But we have to push back on the premise. Is modern society actually egalitarian? The sociological data suggests it is an illusion. For example, the United States, which often leads the charge in criticizing traditional gender roles, has never ratified CEDAW, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
And look at global labor statistics.
They are staggering. Women globally still perform roughly 75% of all unpaid care work. Modernity expects women to attain advanced degrees, work a full-time 40-hour formal job to survive economically, and then come home and do the double shift of domestic labor, cooking, and childcare, often with zero structural support from the state or extended family.
We've basically doubled their workload under the guise of liberation. And then there's the commodification of the female body.
This is where modern patriarchy simply rebranded itself. We have a $500 billion global beauty industry that constantly tells women they are visually inadequate. We have a $100 billion pornography industry that degrades and commodifies female bodies on an industrial scale. We have to ask ourselves, is a society that turns the female form into a mass-produced product for male consumption truly less patriarchal than the past? Or is it just a different, more profitable brand of patriarchy?
Classical Sharia established female legal independence. It gave women absolute property rights over their mahr, their bridal gift, which a husband could never touch. And brilliantly, it recognized domestic work as economically valuable charity. It wasn't a baseline legal expectation a woman had to fulfill for free. Classical jurists debated whether a husband was legally required to pay his wife if she chose to breastfeed their child or clean the house.
It forces us to seriously question whether the modern framework has actually liberated women or if it has simply reshaped their exploitation to better serve the demands of capitalist markets and tax bases.
Which brings us back to the ultimate overarching question of this entire discussion. After looking at the harsh historical baseline, the brilliance of the legal mechanics, the true hidden nature of modern warfare, and the sanitized exploitation of global capitalism, who actually has the moral authority to judge?
That is the core of epistemic colonialism. Thinkers like Dipesh Chakrabarty and Makal Mutua point out that modern human rights discourse often functions like a new civilizing mission. It is the West telling the rest of the world, we have reached the pinnacle of moral evolution, and you must abandon your traditions and copy us.
But let's look at the foundation of that modern consensus, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted in 1948.
Drafted predominantly by Western elites. And look at the timing. When did they suddenly decide they had the moral authority to draft universal rules for humanity? Immediately after initiating and fighting two global world wars that killed over 100 million people.
The 20th century, the era of supreme secular rationalism, was mathematically the bloodiest, deadliest century in the entire history of the human race.
The French philosopher Jacques Ellul wrote extensively about this paradox. The exact same scientific, rational, and technological progress that allows us to cure polio and build MRIs is the exact same progress that allowed us to create atomic weapons, industrial gas chambers, and global digital surveillance states. Technique advances, technology advances, but human moral character does not necessarily follow.
The secular critique always claims that human reason eventually outpaced divine revelation, that we simply outgrew the need for ancient laws.
But the reality shows the opposite. The Sharia provided an internal engine for moral evolution through the Maqasid, the higher objectives. It consistently aimed at justice, dignity, and the preservation of life, working within the harsh constraints of reality. Modernity's supposed progress, on the other hand, is highly fragile. It is geographically isolated to a few post-industrial nations in the West, and it is entirely built on and sustained by the colonial extraction of resources and cheap labor from the global South.
So I want to clarify something before we wrap up. If we shouldn't judge the past by the present standards because our present is deeply hypocritical and built on hidden suffering, are we saying that we can't judge right from wrong at all? Is the lesson here just moral relativism? Are we saying everything is fine as long as it fits the cultural time period?
No. Absolutely not, and it is vital, and make that clear. It is not moral relativism. The Tawhid, the eternal values of justice, mercy, the protection of the vulnerable, and human dignity are absolute. Oppression is wrong in the 7th century, and it is wrong today.
So what exactly are we demanding of the modern critic?
Epistemic humility. We are demanding that you evaluate a historical legal system by looking at its trajectory and its constraints. You have to look at where the society started, the tools they had available, and where the law was actively trying to push them. You do not judge them by comparing their ancient, gritty, resource-starved reality to a modern, idealized, utopian fantasy of the 21st century, a fantasy that doesn't actually exist for the vast majority of the 8 billion people currently on this planet.
It's like judging a brilliant doctor in an ancient, war-torn village for not using an MRI machine to diagnose a patient, while completely ignoring the fact that a modern hospital across the world, which has 10 MRI machines, turns away poor people and lets them die in the street because they don't have health insurance.
That is exactly it. The 7th century law was heavily constrained by the total absence of state infrastructure, but it maximized personal accountability. It humanized the captive. The 21st century has massive, unimaginable infrastructure, but it minimizes accountability. It hides the captive deep inside a corporate supply chain.
There is a thought experiment that was mentioned towards the end of this research that I keep turning over in my mind. It perfectly encapsulates everything we've talked about today. It asks us to imagine a historian living far in the future, let's say the year 2823. And this future historian is looking back at our era, the 21st century.
What did they see when they examine our enlightened society?
They see a civilization that generated multi-billionaires who spend their fortunes racing private rockets to space for fun, while simultaneously 800 million people on the ground suffer from chronic starvation. They see a society that throws away 1.6 billion tons of edible food every single year while children die of malnutrition. They see a global civilization that caused mass extinction, knowingly disrupted the global climate for profit, and kept 50 million human beings in modern forced labor just so consumers could buy cheap electronics and fast fashion.
When you lay it out like that, it is devastating. Would that future historian conclude that the 21st century was a pinnacle of moral superiority?
Or would they look at us the exact same way we look at the ancient world? Would they see our era as incredibly arrogant, fundamentally barbaric, but just remarkably skilled at hiding its cruelty behind bureaucratic paperwork, digital screens, and sanitized corporate logos?
It is a question that completely shatters chronological snobbery. It forces us to stop judging the past and start deeply, critically examining ourselves.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.